Welcome back to another episode of the Reckless Wrench Garage. Today we're going to be going over some bump stop tech and wrapping up the suspension by installing these locked off-road bump stops. A bump stop in its simplest form is the stopping point for your axle or your suspension on full up travel. This way you don't get your axle hitting your oil pan, your tires stuffed up into your fenders, or other contact with other suspension components. Any of that would be bad. So depending on how you have your bump stops set up, you can prevent all of that. In a more advanced form, you can actually use bump stops to fine tune that last couple inches of travel and the rebound from that last couple inches. There's a variety of different types of bump stops. From your most basic, this is your stock style that you're typically going to see. Made of rubber, held on with a stud, and that's all it is a chunk of rubber. When you come up and you contact it, it'll squish a little bit, but it'll prevent you from making too hard of contact with the rest of your suspension. Now we have some aftermarket polyurethane ones. Same basic design, on a different shape, same concept behind them. The polyurethane offers a little bit more flex, and you can see you get them a little bit longer in case you have to bump sooner. And here we have a progressive polyurethane bump stop. You see your gaps inside of here. As you start to contact it, it's going to be kind of a soft contact at first, and it'll get harder and harder as it compresses more and more. Take a look at this clip. You can see these ones in action on the back of Kris's Ranger. You can see that it's actually, even with it being a hard rubber, it's softer than one of these solid bump stops. You can see the progressive action of it. Getting into the next most advanced form of bump stops is our hydraulic bumps, or air bumps as some people call them. Doesn't matter, it's really the same thing. And these are basically miniature shocks. This is how you're going to get that fine tuning of that last couple inches and the rebound from it by adjusting your pressure and your placement of these. So those are the different types of bump stops. Now, why do you need bump stops? Why can't you just throw your suspension together and call it a day? At some point, whether you're rock crawling, flying through the desert, going off sweet jumps, gravity is going to bring you down. When that happens, you don't want your vehicle or you being the driver to suffer from that impact. So you want something to help cushion that. A lot of it ends up being personal preference. So if you're out rock crawling, you're doing a bunch of things slow, you'd be perfectly fine with some polyurethane bumps. If you end up doing something at higher speeds or you just want a smoother ride, you can go with some hydraulic bumps. I chose these ones because while the Suburban is primarily for rock crawling, who doesn't like going out and just having fun and doing whatever you can do? So I plan on going off some sweet jumps and flying through the desert. All of the above.
You ever take it off any sweet jumps?
Now I mentioned these were like miniature shocks. The way they're built is pretty much the same, except you have a strike pad on one side, you have your piston rod, a piston on the inside, with shims set up just very similar to what's on the inside of some aftermarket shocks or coilovers. You have shock oil inside of it with an air charge on it. So in case you didn't already notice, I chose Locked Offroad for the bump stops going on the Suburban. We had the opportunity to meet Riley and John at the Off-Road Expo in Arizona this past April. We were able to take a moment to talk about their company, how they got started, and of course to talk about their bump stop options. So talking to Riley, one day he decided he was going to go jump his truck, but he was ill prepared for the landing, which resulted in some catastrophic failure of certain suspension components. After that, he realized he needed a good quality bump stop at an affordable price, and thus Locked Offroad was born. They're a small company. There's only 3 people involved in it right now. So anytime you call and you order parts, you got questions on something, you're going to be dealing with one of those 3. And that's something that Reckless Wrench really appreciates, is small companies, they care about their customers. These guys, they actually treat their customers like friends, And what more could you ask for? So for mounting options, we have 3 different styles. You have your pin mount, your pinch mount, and your threaded. Your pin mounting option is pretty straightforward. You take your can, you weld it up wherever you want it. You take your bump stop and you slide it up into the can. Stud goes through the top. Throw the nut on it. Pretty straightforward. Now your pinch style can, commonly seen on a lot of vehicles. Also pretty straightforward. You're going to take the can, weld it in place wherever you want it. You're going to take the bump stop, slide it up into it. As you can see, it's somewhat of a snug fit already. And all you're going to do is snug down these bolts. They don't have to be torqued down real tight or anything. Common issue with these is people tighten down these bolts too much. The first time that they actually hit the bump stop and it fully compresses, the piston will get stuck up inside of here and it won't rebound. So in order to get it to come out, loosen the bolt. There you go. And last but not least, we have the threaded mounting style. This is what I chose for the Suburban, all because of the adjustability of it. Now, whether I want to go crawling and set my bump stops in a certain spot, I can do that. If I decide I want to go take some sweet jumps, I can adjust the height of the bump stop. In total, you have right around 3 inches of adjustability from full up to full down. These have an almost completely threaded body on them. You get your threaded sleeve. You're going to weld that into place wherever you want it on your frame. So the mounting style is not the only thing you have to take into consideration when getting bump stops. You also have to consider the size. Here we have 2 diameter sizes available. You have your 2.5 inch and your 2 inch. For the 2.5 inch, you have 2.5 inch travel and 4 inch travel. These are known as the big boys. They recommend this size bump stop for anything over 6,500 pounds, anything that's going to be doing some crazy jumps in the desert. You could see it's quite large compared to the other ones, and yeah, it's beefy as hell. Yeah. For the 2 inch diameter, you have a 2 inch stroke and a 4 inch stroke. Overall, choosing the right size is going to be based on your setup and what you're going to be doing. Locked Offroad suggests for anybody with beams or 16 inches of travel on your front suspension, go with the 4 inch stroke. Anything less than that, go with the 2 inch stroke. For the rear suspension, anything with 8 inches or more of up travel, go with the 4 inch, and anything less than 8 inches, go with the 2 inch. Again, if you're unsure, feel free to give them a call and they can talk you through whatever your setup may be and give you a better suggestion. So that covers your different mounting options and your sizes currently available through Locked Offroad. If you're interested in getting something yourself, feel free to check them out. Give them a call if you have any questions. Keep an eye out for their new releases coming in June 2018. They're going to have more sizes available for bump stops and coilovers and bypass shocks. Now that we've covered all that, let's go ahead and install these and talk about the setup.
Kris already fabricated the front bump stop mounts for both driver and passenger side. He used the CAD process to fabricate these mounts and they came out pretty good. Easiest way to set up these bump stops, get your axle at full compression, set your bump stop on the axle where you want the strike pad to land, and then build off of that. Some things to keep in mind: clearances. So you want to make sure your tires are clearing your fenders. Make sure your steering links and panhard bar is clearing the frame and the oil pan. Another big clearance issue, which might not be apparent at first, is make sure your coilover has ample clearance on the spring to the bump stop itself. Since this is a panhard setup, the axle does have a little bit of sway to it on complete droop travel. So keep that in mind when you're setting these up. One thing that's very helpful is to relieve all of the nitrogen out of the bump stop so you can fully compress it. Fighting 150 psi of nitrogen is not fun to do, so I highly recommend draining the nitrogen out of these and getting yourself a little nitrogen bottle so you could set up and tune these in the future. When Kris set these up, we set this at the highest setting possible since this is an adjustable bump stop, so that way if he needs to tune it, he could spin up, he could adjust this and then actually lower the bump stop to change his full bump travel. So like Kris was saying, the purpose of your bump stop is to bottom out and save some of your expensive components, such as your coilover shock. You don't want your coilover shock bottoming out before your bump stop does, because that could potentially damage your coilover shock and break it. These are expensive to replace. These are much easier and cheaper to replace. We did get the rear coilovers installed in the Suburban. We bent up some shock hoops and we got the 16-inch 2.5 King coilovers installed. We were originally going for the cantilever setup, but due to time constraints and us wanting to get the Suburban back on the road, we decided to go with a traditional setup. As you can see, we had to cut a massive hole in the floor for activities, and we got lots of room for them. Now that you guys are caught up, we're going to jack up the Suburban, take off the coilover shocks, take off the springs, set it at full bump, and then build our bump stop mounts from there. Let's do it. We took one of the springs off the coilovers and left the other one on there. That allowed us to be able to fully compress the shock, but still have a spring on there with the dual rate slider for clearance purposes. So that way when we put the bump stops on there, we know if we're going to have any contact issues with the spring.
So this is a perfect example of what Kris is talking about checking your clearances. When we checked this at full bump, we had plenty of clearance between the coil and the bump stop. We had 2-3 inches or so, but at almost full droop, we still have another 3 inches of down travel to go, and you can see how close our spring is coming to the bump stop. If we go down any further, the coilover's going to lean in further, and we possibly contact it. If you start contacting it, you can bind up your springs. You don't want to run into any of those issues. So we're going to have to mount this in front or behind the coilover on the frame to overcome that. Now that we got the bump stops welded in, the last step is to service them. We're going to be throwing some nitrogen in there. As I mentioned before, they come pre-charged at 150 psi, and they're good up to 400. Right now, we're just going to set it back at the 150 that we got them at. When we go to tune them, ideally you want to start with as high a pressure as you can and adjust down from there. So whenever we go to tune, we'll probably throw them up to 300 or 400 and adjust. But for now, 150, and we'll call it a day. Well, that wraps it up for this episode. We got all 4 bump stops installed, serviced, ready to go. Just about ready to send this Suburban flying off something. Yep. If you guys are in the market for some bump stops, feel free to check out Locked Offroad. We got their website down in the description. If you have any questions about what we did on this episode, it wasn't quite clear, go ahead and put it in the comments below. And as always, if you want to stick around, hit the subscribe button. Until next time. Stay reckless.